In the blood-stained chronicles of American slavery, some names echo with an unsettling resonance, not because they were celebrated, but because they struck terror into the hearts of those who believed their power was absolute. One such name is Isaac, the enslaved butcher from Virginia whose tale of desperation, defiance, and calculated violence left an imprint on a society already haunted by the fear of rebellion. His story is not one of passive endurance or quiet submission. Instead, it is a chilling reminder that even the most oppressed carry within them a capacity for explosive resistance when pushed to the edge of human suffering. Virginia in the early 19th century was a place defined by contradictions. On one hand, it was the cradle of American democracy, producing men who wrote passionately about liberty and freedom. On the other hand, it remained deeply entrenched in a system of slavery that denied those very ideals to hundreds of thousands of African men, women, and children. Plantations stretched across the landscape, powered by enslaved labor, while violence, surveillance, and psychological control were the tools used to enforce obedience. Within this oppressive framework, every enslaved individual carried an unspoken weight, a daily struggle between survival and the yearning for freedom. Isaac was not merely another faceless figure in bondage. His trade set him apart. As a butcher, he had both a skill and access to weapons, knives, cleavers, and the intimate knowledge of how to take apart flesh with speed and precision. To his enslavers, this may have seemed like a harmless assignment, just another labor that served their household. But to Isaac, the tools of his trade became the instruments of a long, simmering fury. For years, he had endured cruelty, humiliation, and the bitter reality of being treated as property. With each act of abuse, the thought of revenge grew sharper, much like the blades he carried. The world Isaac inhabited was shaped by terror on both sides. Slaveholders feared rebellion with an almost obsessive paranoia, aware that their wealth and comfort rested on the backs of those they oppressed. For the enslaved, the terror came in the form of whippings, forced separations, and the ever-present threat of death. These two terrors collided on the night Isaac decided to act. Unlike many rebellions that relied on numbers, Isaac's vengeance was solitary and personal. He did not rally a band of fellow slaves to his side. He wielded his butcher's knives alone, with a cold, deliberate hand. The night of blood that followed was shocking in its intimacy. Isaac's violence was not wild or uncontrolled but methodical, echoing the precise cuts he would have made in his trade. The household he turned on never saw it coming. The enslavers who had once mocked, starved, and beaten him now found themselves on the receiving end of his skill, a grotesque reversal of power that left the community reeling. Word spread quickly, feeding into the already simmering fears that haunted Virginia's plantations. If one man armed only with the tools of his trade could bring such destruction, what might hundreds, or thousands, of enslaved people do if they rose together? Isaac's capture came swiftly. The machinery of the slaveholding world moved with ruthless efficiency to restore its fragile sense of order. Militia men tracked him down, and he was paraded as a symbol of what happened when the enslaved dared to resist. His trial was not about justice but about control. It was designed to send a message, both to the enslaved, who might see in Isaac a symbol of rebellion, and to the enslavers, who demanded reassurance that their power remained unchallenged. His execution was public, brutal, and intended to erase him from the world. Yet it failed to erase his story. For while Isaac's body was destroyed, his actions lived on in whispers, warnings, and distorted retellings. To the enslavers, he was a monster, proof of the savage nature they claimed to see in those they held in bondage. But to the enslaved, his act, however violent, was something more complicated. It was a spark of resistance, a grim demonstration that even the most broken could strike back against a system that thrived on cruelty. His knives carved not just through flesh, but into the fragile illusion of white invulnerability. This is the story of Isaac the Butcher. It is not a tale meant to glorify bloodshed, but neither can it be dismissed as mere savagery. It is a reflection of what happens when human beings are denied their dignity, their freedom, and their very humanity. In the oppressive silence of slavery, Isaac's violent cry tore through the night like a blade, and though his life ended on the gallows, his name endures as one of the most chilling, yet revealing, figures of resistance in Virginia's dark history. The morning sun crept slowly across the Virginia fields, burning away the mist that clung to the earth. For the enslaved, however, The day's brightness did not bring promise. It brought another cycle of labor, another reminder that their lives were not their own. Among them was Isaac, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose back bore the scars of a whip, and whose hands carried the skill of his trade. He was not just another field hand, Isaac was the butcher. The position gave him a role of necessity, yet it also gave him something far more dangerous: access to knives, cleavers, and the sharp tools of his craft. To his masters, Isaac was useful. He slaughtered hogs in the fall, carved beef in the spring, and prepared meat for the household table. But usefulness was not kindness, and value did not mean mercy. His enslavers treated him as they treated all those in bondage, with cruelty wrapped in casual indifference. He ate only when permitted, spoke only when spoken to, and moved always under the eye of men who believed the color of his skin defined his worth. Yet behind Isaac's steady eyes simmered something his masters could not see: rage. It had been born in silence, nurtured through humiliation, and sharpened with every slice of his blade. Isaac was not a man content to bend forever. The life he endured was not simply hard labor. It was a constant stripping away of his humanity. He had been beaten for small mistakes, mocked when his stomach growled with hunger, and forced to watch as fellow slaves were sold away, their cries echoing into the night. Each moment carved another mark into his spirit, until one truth remained: no man could live forever under such weight without either breaking or striking back. Isaac's days followed a grim rhythm. At dawn, he reported to the smokehouse, where the smell of salted pork and blood clung thick in the air. He knew the precise feel of a blade gliding through flesh, the weight of a cleaver cracking bone. The quiet focus it took to strip meat clean. The skill gave him an odd power. His masters depended on him for their meals. But with every stroke of his knife, Isaac thought of other uses for the blade. What if the knife that carved pork should one day carve justice? What if the hands that prepared meat for masters should instead prepare their end? Whispers of rebellion were not new in Virginia. The shadows of past uprisings haunted every plantation. Slaveholders remembered the bloody revolts in the Caribbean and, closer to home, the rising tide of fear that came after Gabriel Prosser's conspiracy and Nat Turner's rebellion. For the enslaved, those stories were dangerous to speak of but impossible to forget. They spread in hushed tones, passed like sparks in the dark, reminding them that resistance, though rare and often doomed, was still possible. Isaac listened, and he remembered. His masters, blind in their arrogance, did not see the storm building in the man who served them. To them, Isaac was silent, obedient, and perhaps even broken. They mistook his quiet for submission. They mistook his steady hands for loyalty. But Isaac's silence was not submission. It was calculation. Every cut he made in the smokehouse, every moment he handled a knife, was practice. Every insult endured was another reason. The turning point came on a night when cruelty tipped into madness. Isaac had worked from dawn until long after dusk, slaughtering and salting meat until his arms trembled with exhaustion. Yet when he faltered, dropping a slab of pork upon the dirt floor, his master's response was swift and merciless. A whip cracked across his back, each strike tearing flesh that had already healed poorly from past lashings. The other enslaved stood frozen, powerless to intervene. Isaac did not cry out, but deep within something shifted. That night, as he lay on the hard floor of the slave quarters, his wounds burning, Isaac knew he would not endure much longer. It was then that he began to plan. Not wildly, not with reckless rage, but with the precision of a butcher. He studied the household, their habits, their vulnerabilities. He knew when they ate, when they slept, when they left doors unlatched. He knew who kept watch and who drank too heavily to notice much after dark. And most importantly, he knew the weight and balance of every blade in the smokehouse. The night he chose was moonless, cloaked in shadows thick enough to hide his movements. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He carried with him not just knives, but the years of humiliation and pain that demanded release. Moving through the house, Isaac's strikes were silent, swift, and terrifyingly precise. The same skill that had once fed his masters now unmade them. Flesh yielded to his blade just as it had countless times before. But this time the cuts were not for survival, they were for vengeance. The house erupted in chaos. Cries pierced the night, mingling with the dull thud of Isaac's cleaver and the metallic hiss of knives slicing through the air. Panic spread, but the violence was over almost as quickly as it began. When the night grew still, The household that had once ruled over him lay broken at his feet. Isaac stood amidst the ruin, his chest heaving, his body spattered with blood, but his spirit, for the first time, felt unchained. He knew freedom could not last. He knew the white world outside would not allow him to slip quietly away. Slave patrols and militias would hunt him, and justice, as they defined it, would come swiftly. But in that moment, Isaac did not think of the gallows. He thought only of the silence, the absence of the voices that had cursed him, the absence of the whip, the absence of chains. By dawn, word had spread. The countryside trembled with fear. Plantation owners whispered frantically, clutching their firearms, imagining their own slaves rising in the night. For them, Isaac was a nightmare made flesh, proof of the violence they had always feared yet themselves had planted. For the enslaved, his deed was both terrifying and electrifying. They knew he would be hunted down, but they also knew he had done what many only dreamed of. He had struck back. Isaac did not escape for long. His capture was inevitable, his trial predetermined, his execution certain. Yet the chapter of his life that ended in blood and fire could not be erased. Slaveholders used his name as a warning, but the enslaved remembered it as something else. A testament that even the most oppressed could seize power, if only for a single night. Thus began the legend of Isaac the Butcher, the man who turned the tools of his bondage into weapons of rebellion. The man who carved not only flesh but also a jagged scar into the conscience of Virginia. The blood was hardly dry on the floorboards of the house before the alarm spread across the Virginia countryside. Isaac's act had torn through the fragile order of slavery like a thunderclap, and now the white community reeled in terror. The killing of a master by a slave was not merely murder. It was rebellion in its most personal, most horrifying form. Word traveled faster than the rising sun, carried on horseback from plantation to plantation, until every landowner whispered the same name with dread: Isaac the Butcher. By morning, the plantation was swarming with men. They were planters, neighbors, and local officials, all armed with muskets, pistols, and fear sharpened into fury. For them, Isaac was not just a fugitive, he was the embodiment of their nightmares. If one enslaved man could rise against his master with such violence, what would prevent others from following? Their system, so dependent on obedience enforced by fear, suddenly seemed vulnerable. To restore order, Isaac had to be caught, and he had to be made an example. Isaac, meanwhile, had fled into the woods. He knew these forests well, having spent years gathering firewood, hunting small game, and moving through the edges of the land at his master's command. The trees became his shield, the shadows his cloak. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind remained razor-sharp. He had always known the cost of his act. Freedom in its fullest sense was beyond reach. The net of slavery's power stretched too wide. Yet he was determined not to surrender easily. For 3 days, Isaac evaded capture. He traveled by night, guided by the stars, and rested by day in hollows and thickets. Streams offered both water and a way to mask his tracks. He moved like the hunter he had once been in secret, cautious and deliberate. Yet the hunt pressed closer with each passing hour. Militia patrols calmed the forests. Bloodhounds were unleashed, and rewards were promised to anyone who might spot him. Posters went up in towns and crossroads, describing him as a dangerous man with strong arms and scars across his back. The enslaved community watched the chase with mixed emotions. Some whispered prayers for his escape, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and hope. Others stayed silent, knowing that to speak Isaac's name too loudly might invite suspicion or punishment. The planters, however, made sure that no enslaved person could aid him. Houses were searched, quarters were watched, and harsh warnings were given. Anyone caught assisting Isaac would face the lash, or worse. Despite his skill, Isaac could not outrun the relentless machinery of capture forever. The turning point came when the hounds picked up his scent near a creek bed. He had paused too long, his feet sinking into the mud as he bent to drink. The dogs bayed furiously, their voices echoing through the trees. Soon after, the militia closed in, their shouts crashing through the silence of the woods. Isaac ran, his heart hammering, but the forest betrayed him. Branches clawed at his clothes, roots caught his feet, and the sound of the dogs grew ever nearer. At last, he reached a clearing. The moonlight revealed a circle of armed men emerging from the trees. Muskets were raised, pistols cocked, and the hounds strained against their leashes, teeth bared. Isaac stood tall, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with defiance. He had no weapon now, no knife to wield. Only his hands, scarred and strong, remained. For a long moment silence hung heavy, broken only by the growl of the hounds. "Drop to the ground!" one of the men shouted. Isaac did not move. His gaze swept across the faces before him, faces twisted with fear, hatred, and triumph. He knew what awaited him: chains, humiliation, and the gallows. Yet he refused to give them the satisfaction of begging. Slowly, he raised his hands, not in surrender but in a gesture of final contempt. The militia swarmed him. They struck him with rifle butts, bound his wrists with rope, and dragged him back through the woods like a captured beast. The hounds snapped at his heels, the men jeering as they hauled him along. Yet Isaac's face remained cold and expressionless, as though the pain no longer touched him. In his silence, there was a kind of victory. He had already done what none of them could erase. Back at the plantation, crowds gathered to see him. Word of his capture spread like wildfire, and men, women, and children came to gape at the man who had dared to carve up his masters. Some hurled insults, spitting at him as he was paraded through the yard. Others stared in awed silence, struck by the sight of a slave who had shattered the line between submission and rebellion. For the enslaved forced to watch, the sight of Isaac in chains was both heartbreaking and electrifying. He had been brought low, yet his defiance lingered in their minds like a spark that refused to die. The white community wasted no time in securing him for trial. They locked him in the county jail, a stone building meant to contain not just criminals but threats to the very order of slavery itself. Guards kept constant watch, their muskets loaded, their nerves frayed. Isaac sat in the darkness of his cell, his wrists raw from the ropes, his back pressed against the cold wall. He did not speak much, but when he did, his words were sharp and unrepentant. "I did what I had to," he reportedly told one guard. "They took everything from me. Now they know what it feels like." The guard spat on the floor, muttering about savagery and vengeance. But Isaac's words carried weight. They were not the ravings of a madman, but the calm testimony of a man who had endured too much and chosen his own form of justice. In the days that followed, the jail became a place of pilgrimage for the fearful and the curious. Planters came to look upon him, muttering that his fate must be swift and severe. Preachers denounced him as a sinner possessed by evil. Yet some whispered, when no one could hear, that perhaps Isaac's act was not madness but the inevitable consequence of bondage. Isaac waited, unflinching, for what he knew must come: the trial, the sentence, and the rope. The courthouse in rural Virginia had never seen such a crowd. Word of Isaac's crimes had traveled far beyond the county lines, pulling in planters, townsfolk, and officials who wanted to witness justice carried out. To the enslavers, Isaac was not merely a murderer. He was a living reminder of the fragility of their rule. They had always whispered about revolt, about the possibility that those they beat and starved might one day rise against them. Now here was living proof. The trial was set quickly, far more quickly than for any white man accused of murder. For Isaac, there would be no lengthy proceedings, no careful deliberations. The outcome had been decided before he ever entered the courtroom. Still, the performance of justice had to be staged. For the community, for the enslaved who were forced to watch, and for history itself. On the morning of the trial, Isaac was led from his cell. Heavy chains bound his wrists and ankles, and armed guards surrounded him. Yet he walked with a steady gait, his eyes fixed straight ahead. There was no slump in his shoulders, no trembling in his legs. The scars on his back peeked through the torn fabric of his shirt, silent testimony to years of brutality. When he entered the courthouse, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some stared with hatred, spitting curses under their breath. Others looked at him with something closer to awe, even fear, as if he were less a man and more a force of nature. The enslaved, forced to attend under the watchful eye of overseers, kept their expressions carefully blank, but in their hearts they felt the weight of his presence. Isaac was one of them, and his defiance spoke volumes. The judge presiding over the case was a stout man, his powdered wig barely concealing the sweat that rolled down his temples. He had every intention of making an example of Isaac, but he also knew that the trial had to appear orderly, proper, and beyond reproach. The system demanded not only Isaac's death, but the appearance of legitimacy. The charges were read aloud: murder, rebellion, and treason against the peace of Virginia. Each word echoed through the courtroom like a drumbeat, designed to emphasize not just the crime but the threat Isaac represented. The prosecutor, a fiery-tongued lawyer, painted Isaac as a monster. He described the killings in grotesque detail, dwelling on the blood, the knives, the horror of white bodies carved up by black hands. His voice quivered with indignation as he declared, "This man is not human. He is a savage beast who turned against the very family that fed him. If such a man is allowed to live, then none of us are safe in our beds." The gallery erupted with nods and muttered affirmations. Fear had done its work. Every white face in the room was united in the belief that Isaac represented not just himself but a threat from every enslaved man and woman across Virginia. When it came time for Isaac to speak, the room fell silent. All eyes turned toward him. His chains clinked as he rose, and he stood tall, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. "I was no beast until they made me one," he said. "I worked their fields. I cut their meat. I bowed when they demanded it. And still they beat me. Still they mocked me. Still they treated me like nothing but an animal. So I gave them what they gave me. You call it murder. I call it justice." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The judge's gavel slammed down, calling for order. But the damage had been done. Isaac's words cut through the air like a blade, leaving a wound in the fragile image of control the slaveholders clung to. The prosecutor sputtered, declaring his words proof of his wickedness, but Isaac did not waver. He sat back down, his expression calm, as if he had already accepted his fate. The defense, such as it was, offered nothing. His appointed lawyer, a local man tasked only with making the trial appear legitimate, barely spoke. There was no attempt to argue self-defense, no plea for mercy. Everyone knew the verdict was certain. The entire proceeding was less about guilt and innocence than about theater. Outside the courthouse, the enslaved whispered to one another when no overseers were near. Isaac's words spread like wildfire among them. He had spoken not as a man broken, but as a man unafraid. Even in chains, even facing death, he had refused to bow. That defiance was dangerous, and it was exactly why the trial had to end with his execution. By afternoon, the jury returned. Their decision took less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by hanging. The crowd erupted, some with cheers of approval, others with a grim silence. The enslavers felt reassured. Order, they believed, had been restored. But beneath the surface, the unease remained. If Isaac could do this, who might be next? As the guards led him away, Isaac turned his head toward the enslaved gathered at the back of the room. His eyes locked with theirs, and though he said nothing, the message was clear. He had not begged. He had not repented. He had stood tall before the men who claimed ownership of his body and declared his humanity in the only way left to him. That night, the town buzzed with talk of the trial. Some declared satisfaction, convinced that Isaac's hanging would put an end to their fears. Others admitted, in hushed tones, that they would never sleep easily again. For the enslaved, the trial was both a tragedy and a beacon. Isaac would die, but his defiance would live on in memory, whispered from one cabin to the next, a story of a man who dared to carve his own destiny. The date of his execution was set for the following week. The gallows would be built in the town square, and the community would be summoned to watch. It would not merely be a hanging, it would be a ritual, a performance of power meant to remind every enslaved person of their place. Yet the men who planned it knew, deep down, that something had shifted. No rope could erase the fact that Isaac had risen. No spectacle could erase the fear that lingered in their hearts. Isaac, sitting in his cell, understood this. The gallows would claim his body, but not his story. And in that knowledge, he found a grim kind of victory. The morning of Isaac's execution dawned bright and merciless, the Virginia sun climbing high into a sky so blue it mocked the dread in men's hearts. From miles around, people poured into the town square. Planters in their polished boots, townsfolk with children perched on shoulders, and enslaved men and women herded under watchful eyes. It was not merely a hanging, it was a public ritual, a demonstration of power staged for all to see. The gallows, newly built and towering, stood at the center like an altar to the institution of slavery itself. For the white community, Isaac's death would be reassurance. The killings he had carried out had shattered their sense of safety, exposing the brittle foundation of their control. Today, they would restore order. His body swinging from the rope would serve as a warning. Resistance was futile, rebellion meant death. But beneath their bravado, fear lingered. The very need for such a spectacle betrayed their unease. Isaac was led from the jail just before noon, His wrists and ankles were bound in heavy irons, and guards marched on either side, muskets glinting in the sun. Yet he walked with the same steady stride he had shown in court, his shoulders squared, his head unbowed. There was no plea on his lips, no tremor in his steps. The crowd, expecting to see a broken man, instead saw someone who carried himself with a calm defiance that unsettled even his captors. Children craned their necks to glimpse the figure who had become legend in only a matter of weeks. Women whispered nervously, some crossing themselves as though warding off evil. Men spat curses, declaring him a monster. And behind them all, the enslaved watched silently, their expressions carefully blank under the gaze of overseers. But within, their hearts pounded with something far more complex than fear. As Isaac mounted the wooden steps of the gallows, the murmurs swelled. The hangman, sweating under the sun, adjusted the rope, his hands fumbling slightly as if the weight of the moment unnerved even him. The sheriff read the charges again, his voice booming across the square: murder, rebellion, treason. Each word landed like a hammer blow, a reminder of the crime that had brought them here. "Do you have any final words?" the sheriff asked. For a moment, silence fell. Then Isaac lifted his head, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried, steady and unshaken. "I was a man before I was their slave," he said. "They took my freedom, they took my dignity, they took my life every day in chains. But I took something back, and I do not regret it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some shouted in outrage, demanding the sheriff silence him. Others stared wide-eyed, struck by the sheer boldness of his final declaration. The enslaved, standing in the heat, felt the words like sparks against dry grass. It was dangerous even to let their eyes betray emotion, but inside, something shifted. Isaac had given them a message more powerful than any sermon, that even in the face of certain death, a man could claim his humanity. The hangman slipped the rope around Isaac's neck. The coarse fibers scratched his skin, but he did not flinch. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, as though he were looking far beyond the gallows, beyond the jeering crowd, beyond the institution that had crushed so many before him. The sheriff gave the signal. The trapdoor creaked open and Isaac's body dropped. For a heartbeat, silence hung heavier than the body swaying in the air. Then the crowd erupted, some cheering, some gasping, some crossing themselves in relief. The enslaved, however, said nothing. They stood still, their eyes cast down, but in their hearts, Isaac's final words, repeated like a drumbeat, "I was a man before I was their slave." The spectacle ended quickly. The body was left hanging for hours, a grim reminder meant to terrify anyone who might dream of rebellion. Parents forced their children to look. Overseers marched the enslaved past the gallows, ensuring they witnessed the price of defiance. Yet for all its intended power, the sight did not erase Isaac's act. Instead, it branded him deeper into memory. That night, when the square was finally empty and Isaac's body cut down, the whispers began. In the cabins of the enslaved, his story grew. Some called him reckless, doomed from the start. Others called him brave, a man who had carved justice out of the flesh of his masters. To the enslavers, he was a nightmare ended. To the enslaved, he was a spark, dangerous, fleeting, but unforgettable. The white community returned to their routines, but a shadow lingered over every plantation. They locked their doors earlier at night, tightened their patrols, and sharpened their weapons. They told themselves they had stamped out the danger, but their fear betrayed the truth. Isaac's rebellion was not just his own. It was a reminder that every slave, beaten into silence, might carry the same fury. In death, Isaac had become larger than life. His body had been broken by rope, but his story endured. Slaveholders tried to twist it, painting him as a savage beast. Preachers thundered from pulpits that he had been damned for his sins. But the enslaved remembered differently. They remembered a man who had refused to bow, who had used the very tools of his bondage to strike back, and who had faced death with unflinching eyes. For years afterward, the name Isaac the Butcher carried weight. To some, it was a warning. To others, it was a spark of dangerous inspiration. His act had not ended slavery, but it had pierced the illusion of white invulnerability. And though his masters sought to erase him with rope and silence, his defiance lived on, in whispers, in fear, and in the unbreakable truth that no system of chains could ever fully crush the will of a man determined to be free. The gallows in the Virginia Square were dismantled within days, their timber carted away as if to erase the memory of what had taken place there. But no amount of hammering or hauling could remove the shadow Isaac left behind. His execution was supposed to restore order, to reassure the planters that their world remained secure. Instead, it deepened the very fears they had tried to smother. In the weeks after his death, the name Isaac the butcher lingered in every conversation, spoken in hushed tones among the enslaved and with anger among the whites. For the planters, he became the embodiment of their nightmare as a slave who had not only murdered but done so with chilling precision, using his trade as a weapon. They told and retold the story, each version more gruesome than the last, as if by exaggerating his violence they could justify the cruelty of their reprisals. On plantations across Virginia, slaveholders grew harsher. Patrols were doubled, curfews tightened, punishments intensified. Overseers prowled the fields with whips at the ready, convinced that rebellion might be lurking in every shadow. Families that had once prided themselves on benevolence abandoned even the pretense of kindness. Isaac's name had stripped away their illusions. If a man they thought loyal could rise in the night and strike them down, then none could be trusted. But in the slave quarters, the memory of Isaac was something altogether different. There, his story was whispered like a prayer, passed from one to another in the quiet moments after dusk. Around smoldering fires, old men leaned close and told the tale, how Isaac had turned the butcher's knives against those who had tormented him, how he had stood unrepentant in the courtroom, how he had spoken his truth on the gallows. Children listened wide-eyed, their imaginations fired by the vision of a man who refused to bow. For some, Isaac's story was terrifying. It reminded them of the brutal costs of defiance. They had seen the rope around his neck, the crowd cheering his death, the lash that fell harder afterward. To these men and women, rebellion meant only suffering. Yet even in their fear, a flicker of pride remained. Isaac had shown that even a single man, stripped of freedom, could seize power, if only for a fleeting moment. For others, Isaac's act was a seed. It did not grow openly. No enslaved person could speak of rebellion without risking the lash or the auction block. But it grew nonetheless. His defiance became a hidden strength, a reminder that their masters were not invincible. Each whispered retelling was an act of quiet resistance, a way of keeping alive the dream of freedom in a world designed to crush it. The white community, for all its efforts to silence his memory, could not escape the mark Isaac left upon them. They built higher fences, kept weapons closer, and lay awake at night listening for the creak of floorboards. Mothers pulled children in close when the wind rattled shutters, their minds replaying the bloody night of Isaac's vengeance. Even in their power, they felt hunted by the ghost of a man they had hanged. Ministers thundered from pulpits that Isaac's rebellion was proof of the dangers of educating or empowering the enslaved. Some declared it evidence of inherent savagery, citing his deeds as justification for tighter chains. Yet others, speaking in quieter circles, admitted that his actions were not born of nature but of cruelty. A man can only be whipped so many times before he strikes back. One planter was overheard saying, though he quickly bit his tongue. Outside Virginia, Isaac's story traveled. Newspapers carried lurid accounts, shaping him into both a monster and a cautionary tale. Abolitionists seized upon the story as evidence of slavery's inhumanity. They argued that Isaac's violence was the inevitable consequence of bondage, that men treated like animals would one day turn with the ferocity of cornered beasts. Slaveholders, in turn, countered with demands for harsher laws and more vigilant control. The legacy of Isaac was thus contested, his memory bent to serve the purposes of those who spoke of him. To the enslavers, he was a warning. To abolitionists, he was a symptom. To the enslaved, he was a symbol, a dangerous one, but one that could not be forgotten. Years passed, and yet Isaac's name did not fade. Around cabin fires, the story remained alive, sometimes softened for children, sometimes told in all its bloody detail to young men dreaming of escape. For every lash that fell, for every chain fastened, someone remembered Isaac's defiant words, "I was a man before I was their slave." The aftermath of his rebellion reshaped more than fear. It reshaped the psychology of both enslaver and enslaved. Planters became more paranoid. Their power maintained not through confidence but through constant vigilance. And the enslaved, though cowed by harsher punishments, carried within them the knowledge that one of their own had struck at the heart of the system. Isaac's body had been broken by the rope, but his spirit endured in the minds of those who bore the same chains. His legacy was not written in books or carved in stone. It lived in whispers, in glances, in the unspoken knowledge that the line between obedience and rebellion was thinner than the whites dared to admit. And so, in the quiet fields of Virginia, long after the gallows were torn down, Isaac remained. His story was not erased. It pulsed in the memory of the enslaved, haunted the dreams of the enslavers, and stood as a dark, unyielding reminder no system, however brutal, could fully extinguish the fire of a man who refused to bow. The execution of Isaac was supposed to mark an ending. In the minds of Virginia's ruling class, the gallows would silence whispers of rebellion, cleanse the stain of bloodshed, and re-establish their fragile sense of order. But instead of closure, Isaac's defiance opened a wound that spread far beyond the plantation where his knives had carved terror. His name became a shadow creeping across Virginia, unsettling towns, farms, and households with equal measure. In the countryside, every noise in the night now carried new meaning. A snapped twig could be the first step of a plotting slave. A whispered conversation between field hands might not be about corn harvests, but about conspiracies. The overseers who once strutted through the quarters with easy authority now lingered at the edges, eyes narrowed, fingers twitching toward their whips. Isaac had shown them what one man could do, and they imagined what many could accomplish. Planters doubled their militias. Courthouse meetings swelled with anxious men demanding stricter laws and faster punishments. Newspapers printed exaggerated accounts of Isaac's crime, some claiming he had slaughtered an entire household with inhuman rage, others insisting he had been possessed by the devil himself. The facts of the case mattered little. What mattered was the lesson the white community drew, that their way of life rested on a powder keg, and Isaac had been the spark. Fear moved into the parlors of the wealthy. Ladies who once dismissed the enslaved as docile now clutched their children when a servant passed too close. Gentlemen who had prided themselves on their kind treatment now locked their doors at night and slept with pistols beneath their pillows. Even small acts, a delayed greeting, averted eyes, a footstep too heavy, could unravel a family's composure. The enslaved, who had always lived under surveillance, found themselves under scrutiny sharper than ever. For the enslaved, the atmosphere grew suffocating. Patrols stormed into cabins unannounced, searching for weapons, books, or even scraps of paper that might suggest plotting. Curfews were enforced with brutal lashes. Some men were sold south on mere suspicion of defiance, their families torn apart without warning. Women were forced to account for every errand, every hour, as if their very existence carried danger. Isaac's act had turned the entire enslaved population into suspects. Yet, despite the crackdown, whispers persisted. The enslaved spoke Isaac's name in secret, sometimes not aloud but in coded phrases, in looks shared by firelight. For some, he was a hero who had dared what others only dreamed. For others, he was a warning that violence could bring only ruin. But all agreed on one truth: he had shown that the enslaved were not powerless. His knives had pierced not just flesh but the illusion of white invulnerability. The fear among the slaveholders was not only about violence. It was about the recognition that the system they had built was rotten at its core. Isaac's rebellion was not the first and would not be the last. Only a few years earlier, Virginia had trembled under the memory of Gabriel's failed uprising, and whispers of Nat Turner would soon come to follow. Isaac fit into this growing pattern, a chapter in a story that terrified the South, the possibility that the enslaved would no longer suffer silently. In Richmond, debates broke out among lawmakers. Some argued that the system of slavery had to be made even stricter. Harsher laws, fewer privileges, more chains. Others, in rare moments of honesty, wondered if slavery itself was the problem. So long as we keep men in bondage, one legislator confided privately, we will never sleep in peace. But such voices were quickly drowned out by the thunder of those unwilling to risk their fortunes. Fear did not bring change. It brought only deeper cruelty. The militia, swollen with volunteers, began staging drills in village squares. Muskets gleamed in the sun as men practiced maneuvers meant to crush uprisings before they began. Children watched wide-eyed, while enslaved laborers looked on in silence, forbidden to show expression. The message was clear: rebellion would be met with overwhelming force. But beneath the surface, the whites revealed more than strength. They revealed how shaken they were, how easily their authority could tremble. In taverns and inns, travelers carried the story of Isaac beyond Virginia. His tale spread to Maryland, the Carolinas, even as far as New York. where abolitionist presses seized on it as proof of slavery's inhumanity. To the enslavers, this spreading tale was a contagion. To the enslaved, it was a spark carried on the wind. Each retelling, whether distorted or true, added to the weight of his legend. Isaac himself had been reduced to ash, but his presence lingered like smoke. His rebellion had been an act of solitary vengeance, yet its impact was collective. Fear became the new overseer, stalking both black and white alike. The enslaved lived under harsher scrutiny, the whites under the burden of their own nightmares. The landscape of Virginia shifted in subtle ways. Where once a master might have walked unarmed among his laborers, he now carried a pistol. Where once a plantation mistress might have left her children in the care of a trusted nurse, she now hesitated, her trust poisoned by suspicion. Every act of kindness became a calculation, every expression of loyalty doubted. Isaac's knives had cut into more than flesh. They had cut into the fragile bond that slavery depended upon, the illusion that absolute control was possible. And yet, amid all the terror, something unspoken grew among the enslaved. Isaac's act reminded them of their humanity, their ability to resist, however briefly, the system that sought to break them. His rebellion had not freed anyone, but it had carved a space in memory, a story to be told when the night was darkest. Virginia could not forget Isaac. His rebellion was both a wound and a mirror, reflecting the brutality of a society built on bondage. And as the years passed, his name remained in the shadows, whispered with fear by whites and with defiance by blacks. Fear had spread across Virginia, but so too had the knowledge that no chain was unbreakable, no master untouchable, and no system invulnerable to the blade of resistance. The trial of Isaac the Butcher was less a pursuit of justice than a performance, staged to reaffirm the dominance of Virginia's planter elite. By the time Isaac was dragged in chains before the magistrates, his guilt was already assumed, his fate already sealed. The court was not a place for truth, but a theater where white society could rehearse its fears, vent its rage, and reassure itself of control. The courthouse was crowded on the day proceedings began. Farmers, planters, overseers, even curious townsfolk pressed into the chamber, their faces tense with expectation. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted to see the monster who had dared to carve up his masters. They wanted to believe that by watching him condemned, the order of the world would be restored. Isaac entered under heavy guard, his wrists and ankles bound, his shoulders broad from years of labor. He walked with a steadiness that unsettled the crowd. There was no madness in his eyes, no shame, no trembling fear. To many, that composure was more frightening than the murders themselves. Here was a man who had killed with precision, and yet he stood before them unbowed. The charges were read swiftly: multiple counts of murder, rebellion against lawful authority, disturbing the peace of the Commonwealth. Each word was recited with cold formality, as if legal phrases could contain the horror that had gripped Virginia. Witnesses were called. Neighbors who had seen the aftermath, militiamen who had captured Isaac, a trembling young boy spared by chance on the night of blood. Their testimonies painted Isaac as a creature of unnatural violence. They spoke of gore, of bodies butchered beyond recognition, of a man moving with terrifying skill. But what disturbed the court most was not the evidence of Isaac's crimes. It was his own voice. When asked why he had done it, Isaac did not deny or plead. He answered with a clarity that shook the chamber. "I was a man before I was their slave," he declared. "They beat me, starved me, mocked me. I gave them back what they gave to me, flesh for flesh." Gasps rippled through the crowd. To hear an enslaved man speak of himself as a man, as an equal, was an act of defiance greater than the murders themselves. His words unsettled the delicate lies upon which slavery rested, that the enslaved were content, that obedience was natural, that rebellion was madness. Isaac shattered those illusions with a few measured sentences. The magistrates wasted no time. They declared him guilty on every count, their verdict a foregone conclusion. Yet the trial had served its purpose. It had transformed Isaac from a man into a symbol. For the whites, he became the embodiment of their darkest fears, proof that beneath every enslaved face lurked potential rebellion. For the enslaved, his words, carried beyond the courthouse in whispers, became a torch lighting the thought that dignity and resistance could not be chained. After the trial, newspapers seized on the story. Some papers, catering to planters, painted Isaac as a demon, describing his acts with grotesque embellishments. They wrote of him foaming at the mouth, eyes wild with bloodlust, as if his rebellion had been driven by animal fury rather than calculated intent. Others went further, blaming Northern abolitionists for corrupting slaves with ideas of freedom. Each article twisted Isaac's actions to suit an agenda. But not all accounts followed the planter's script. In distant towns, where whispers of abolition grew louder, Isaac's story was retold with a different emphasis. Writers described his composure at trial, his refusal to beg, his chilling declaration of manhood. To them, he was not a monster but a mirror held up to the nation, reflecting the violence inherent in slavery. His knives had done in one night what the system did daily: tear flesh, break families, and reduce human beings to suffering bodies. This dual legacy, monster to some, martyr to others, was forged in the trial's aftermath. In Virginia, the white community leaned on the narrative of savagery, teaching their children that Isaac was proof of the danger lurking in every enslaved person. But in the quarters, a different version lived on. Enslaved men and women remembered his words, passing them along in fragments. "I was a man before I was their slave," became a refrain whispered in the dark, a quiet affirmation of humanity in a world designed to deny it. The official records of the trial were sanitized. Clerks reduced his testimony to a few brief lines, stripping away its fire. But memory could not be erased so easily. Every witness carried away an impression, and every retelling in homes, taverns, and cabins reshaped the story. Over time, the truth blurred with rumor, until Isaac was less a man than a legend. Some claimed he had killed with superhuman strength, others that he had smiled on the gallows. For the enslaved, the legend grew brighter, for the enslavers darker. Even as the gallows claimed his body, the trial ensured that Isaac's spirit would not die quietly. His defiance in court, his refusal to collapse under the weight of condemnation, made him unforgettable. The whites had sought to make an example of him, but in doing so, they created something they could not control, a story that lived on, twisting itself into the fabric of Virginia's memory. Isaac the butcher had stood in chains, surrounded by enemies, condemned by law, and he had spoken words that cut deeper than any blade. The trial was their stage, but the performance belonged to him. In the silence after his sentence was pronounced, the crowd did not feel victory. They felt unease, as though the rope they prepared for Isaac might one day be needed again and again, for others who would not bow. And so the trial ended not with the restoration of order, but with the birth of a legend that would outlive the courthouse, the gallows, and even the men who condemned him. A legend of blood and defiance, of a butcher who carved not only bodies, but the fragile confidence of a society built on chains. Isaac's body had been buried in haste, laid in an unmarked grave outside the town's limits, but the earth could not contain the story of what he had done. In fact, his burial marked only the beginning of his second life, a life lived in whispers, in fragments of memory, and in the half-hidden songs of the enslaved. Though the authorities tried to erase him, Isaac became more present in death than he had ever been in life. Among the enslaved communities, his name passed from mouth to mouth, a secret too dangerous to speak openly, but too powerful to suppress. Men gathered around the flickering light of a hearth after a long day in the fields, speaking in hushed tones about the butcher who had taken his master's knives and turned them into weapons of freedom. Women, rocking children to sleep, hummed lullabies that carried veiled references to a man who wouldn't bow. Children, wide-eyed with curiosity, listened eagerly when elders bent low to tell the tale. The story changed with each retelling, not because the essence was forgotten, but because it grew. In some versions, Isaac killed not just a few but entire households, striking fear into the heart of Virginia. In others, he vanished after the murders, never captured, living on as a ghostly avenger haunting the plantations. A few swore that he had smiled on the gallows, defying death itself. Each embellishment served a purpose: to magnify his legend, to turn a single act of rebellion into a myth large enough to inspire hope where little existed. The enslaved drew strength from these tales, though they cloaked their admiration in caution. To speak too openly of Isaac was to invite suspicion, punishment, or worse. Overseers were quick to silence any mention of his name, often with the whip. Yet the more the whites sought to bury him, the deeper his memory rooted itself in the minds of those who longed for freedom. Isaac had become what the planters feared most, a symbol. For the white community, the spread of Isaac's legend was unsettling. Planters overheard fragments of whispered conversations in the quarters, saw glances exchanged between field hands, and knew the story was alive. They tightened patrols, enacted harsher rules, and tried to stamp out every spark of rebellion. Yet the more they cracked down, the more they revealed their fear. And fear, once exposed, undermined their authority more than any knife could. Beyond Virginia, Isaac's story traveled in unexpected ways. Newspapers had already carried reports of his crime and execution, each retelling bent to suit the editor's perspective. In the South, his name was often spat with disgust, painted as proof of the barbarism of slaves. But in the North, abolitionist presses seized upon the tale with fervor. They reframed Isaac not as a monster, but as a man pushed beyond endurance by the cruelties of slavery. Pamphlets described his composure at trial, his defiant last words, his refusal to beg for mercy. To abolitionists, Isaac was evidence that slavery bred violence, that men could only be dehumanized for so long before they struck back. In churches sympathetic to abolition, preachers drew parallels between Isaac's defiance and biblical figures who had risen against oppression. Moses struck Pharaoh's land with plagues. One minister declared, and Isaac struck his master with the knife. Congregations nodded, uneasy yet moved. His name became a parable, proof that bondage was not a state ordained by God, but a human cruelty destined to collapse under its own weight. Even among free black communities in the North, Isaac's story was retold with a mixture of awe and sorrow. In meeting halls and back rooms, leaders debated the meaning of his rebellion. Some praised his courage, calling him a martyr for dignity. Others worried his violence would be used as justification for harsher laws against all black people. Yet regardless of their stance, none could deny that his defiance stirred something deep in the heart of their struggle. Meanwhile, in Virginia's fields and cabins, Isaac's legend became woven into the very rhythm of daily life. Songs arose, coded, layered with meaning, sung in the cadence of work. One verse might speak of a butcher's blade that cut through chains, while another hinted at a man who would not kneel. To the overseers, these songs were nothing but nonsense tunes. To the enslaved, they were hymns of resistance, carrying Isaac's spirit through the fields like a hidden current of strength. Children who had been too young to witness the trial grew up hearing the story as if it were part of the air they breathed. For them, Isaac was less a man than a figure of legend, proof that the system of slavery, for all its whips and gallows, could still be challenged. His memory became a quiet inheritance, passed from generation to generation, a reminder that even in chains, dignity remained. But legends are never simple. Isaac's story was double-edged, both empowering and dangerous. For every enslaved person who felt inspired by his defiance, there was another who feared the consequences of following his path. They remembered the tightened patrols, the harsher punishments, the families torn apart in the aftermath. Isaac had shown that rebellion was possible, but he had also shown how dearly it was bought. His legend carried both hope and warning, fire and ash. As years passed, Isaac's name lingered in the margins of history, never fully erased despite the efforts of those who sought to silence it. In plantation records, he was reduced to a criminal, a cautionary tale. In the quarters, he was remembered as a man who had stood unbroken in the face of chains. And in the abolitionist press, he became a symbol of the very violence slavery inflicted on both enslaved and enslaver alike. By the time Nat Turner's rebellion erupted in 1831, Isaac's story was still alive in whispers. Some even claimed that Turner himself had heard the tale, that the memory of a butcher with knives had helped fuel his vision of resistance. Whether true or not, the connection was telling. Isaac had carved his name into the fabric of the struggle, ensuring that his defiance echoed long after his body was gone. Isaac the butcher had lived as one man, enslaved and beaten. He died on the gallows, condemned as a criminal. But in legend, he became something greater, a ghost that haunted Virginia, a fire that smoldered in the hearts of the enslaved, a name that refused to be silenced. His knives had cut through flesh, but his memory cut through time, reminding generations that even in the darkest night of bondage, the spark of resistance could never be fully extinguished. The story of Isaac the butcher did not end with his death, nor with the whispers that followed. It endured, reshaped across decades, crossing boundaries of class, race, and geography. His name became a mirror in which people saw what they most feared, what they most desired, or what they most wished to forget. To some, He was a savage criminal, to others a martyr of resistance, and to still others a symbol too complex to fit neatly into either category. The planters who survived Isaac's era tried hard to erase him. Plantation records barely noted his existence beyond the crime. A Negro butcher, executed for murder. Court documents reduced him to a statistic in the long chain of legal cases involving enslaved resistance. In the official archive of Virginia, he was no more than a blot of ink on aging paper. Yet erasure is rarely final. For every attempt to bury him, Isaac's memory pushed back through the cracks. Among the enslaved, Isaac's legacy was not written in ledgers but carried in voices, songs, and stories. He became part of a living oral tradition that outlasted whips, chains, and overseers. For them, Isaac's act was not madness, but the ultimate expression of a human spirit refusing to break. They remembered him as a man who took the very tools of his oppression, the butcher's knives meant to serve his master's table, and turned them into weapons of liberation. His courage became a lesson freedom, even if bought with blood, was worth the price. Yet Isaac's legacy was not purely heroic. Many enslaved people, particularly elders, spoke of him with caution. They understood that his rebellion had brought harsher punishment, more patrols, and deeper suspicion upon their communities. For them, Isaac's story was a warning about the heavy cost of resistance. It forced a difficult question. Was it better to die striking back or to endure for the sake of one's family? In this tension lay the truth of his legacy. Isaac was both a source of pride and a reminder of risk. In the broader history of American resistance, Isaac stood as an early marker of a pattern that would repeat again and again. Before Nat Turner, before John Brown, before the great slave escapes that punctured the South's stability, there was Isaac, carving his rebellion into flesh and memory. His story revealed what slaveholders feared most, that beneath the enforced obedience of their laborers simmered a rage that could erupt with devastating violence. This fear shaped laws and customs long after Isaac's execution. Virginia, like other southern states, passed stricter codes on the movement of enslaved people, limited their access to tools, and doubled down on patrol systems meant to keep rebellion in check. Every regulation bore the shadow of Isaac's knives. In this way, his rebellion helped harden the institution of slavery even as it exposed its vulnerabilities. For abolitionists in the North, Isaac's story carried a different meaning. They used his defiance as both evidence and warning. Pamphlets argued that slavery was not merely an immoral system but a dangerous one, forcing human beings into such despair that violence became inevitable. If America does not end slavery, one abolitionist writer declared, slavery will end America blade by blade. In Isaac's knives, they saw not barbarism but prophecy, proof that bondage would someday tear the nation apart. When the Civil War erupted decades later, echoes of Isaac's story resurfaced. Soldiers, abolitionists, and freedmen invoked the long tradition of enslaved resistance to frame the conflict not just as a political struggle, but as the fulfillment of generations of defiance. Isaac was remembered as one of many who had refused to bow. Though his name was not as famous as Nat Turner's, his story circulated in sermons, speeches, and even in hushed campfire conversations among black soldiers who now bore rifles instead of butchers' blades. But Isaac's legacy did not stop at emancipation. After the war, as the South entered Reconstruction, former slaveholders resurrected his story to feed a narrative of white victimhood. To them, Isaac became a symbol of the chaos and danger they claimed would follow the end of slavery. In their retellings, he was not a man but a monster, proof that black freedom meant white death. These twisted versions of his story were passed into the culture of the lost cause, shaping Southern memory for generations. Meanwhile, in black communities, Isaac's memory lived differently. Families told his story alongside those of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Nat Turner. Isaac was not as celebrated, perhaps because of the brutality of his rebellion, but his tale was preserved nonetheless. He was the man who had taken a knife to slavery itself, carving out a place in history that could not be erased. For many, he was a reminder that freedom had never been given freely. It had always been taken, demanded, fought for. In the 20th century, as scholars and writers began to revisit the history of slavery with fresh eyes, Isaac's story resurfaced in academic journals and historical studies. Some historians condemned him as a murderer, an aberration in an otherwise peaceful slave population. Others argued the opposite, that his rebellion revealed the hidden reality of enslaved life, the suppressed anger, the daily humiliations that could push any man to violence. In classrooms and books, his legacy became a subject of debate. Was Isaac a criminal or a freedom fighter? The answer depended on who was telling the story. For artists, musicians, and poets of the Black freedom struggle, Isaac's legacy offered raw material for reflection. His knives appeared in poems as metaphors for cutting chains, his defiance echoed in blues lyrics about refusing to kneel, his name invoked in plays that examined the brutal choices slavery forced upon the human spirit. Through art, Isaac was resurrected again and again, each time speaking to new generations wrestling with the meaning of resistance. Today, Isaac remains a contested figure. To some, he is a ghost best left buried, a reminder of violence too grim to celebrate. To others, he is an ancestor of courage, proof that even in the darkest corners of American history, people rose up rather than submit. His story is not simple, not clean, not easy to digest, but perhaps that is precisely why it matters. Isaac's legacy lies in the fact that he cannot be reduced to one thing. He was a man enslaved, a butcher by trade, a murderer by act, a rebel by spirit. His knives cut through bodies, but they also cut into history, leaving scars that still mark the story of America. His defiance shows us that resistance takes many forms, some noble, some bloody, all human. In the end, Isaac's true legacy may be the questions he leaves behind. What would you endure before you broke? What price is too high for freedom? Can violence ever be justified when the world denies your very humanity? These questions haunted Virginia in his time, and they haunt us still. Isaac the Butcher is more than a figure of the past. He is a reminder that history is not just written in ink, but in blood, not just preserved in documents, but carried in memory. His story belongs to those who whisper his name, who see in his knives the reflection of an unbroken spirit. And so, though his body was buried in an unmarked grave, not as a criminal, not as a saint, but as a symbol of resistance, raw and undeniable, carved forever into the American story.